you very much, Gina. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be back at the MacGill Summer School here in Glentees. Thank you to Joe for the invitation, and thank you to my fellow panellists for what I'm sure will be a very interesting and lively debate, and to all of you for taking the time to come and participate. The topic: many of our institutional failings are rooted in our political culture. Our so-called political culture provides, in my opinion, an easy and convenient means of excusing some of what characterises the very worst of Irish officialdom. Sometimes it suits us to blame the so-called prevailing political culture rather than hold those in positions of genuine political power and influence to account. For some reason, we seem at times content to decry the political culture that delivers a health system that is repeatedly compared to Angola, an education system which has unacceptably high levels of illiteracy, a social security system that incentivises people not to work and often fails our most vulnerable people. Yet we rarely really hold the politicians which feed off this so-called culture to account. The absence of political leadership is a much greater cause of inertia and crisis in our system than some vague notion of a poor political culture. The phrase systems failure is far too often used as a crutch to mask the lack of real political leadership. These failings have been accepted and they have been institutionalised within Irish political life to the point that leadership has become defined by the metric of electoral success and the preservation of the status quo. Tweedledum seamlessly becomes Tweedledee. The link between ideas and electoral outcomes no longer seems to have any place in Irish elections. Politics has been reduced, particularly in recent years, to a game of personalities and seat numbers and very little more. It hasn't always been so. On Sean Lamass's retirement as Taoiseach in 1966, the Irish Times appraised his legacy, saying, "From his concept of Ireland came employment for thousands upon thousands, and if his concept changed later with a changing world, he was consistent in his application." On Garret Fitzgerald's end as Taoiseach in 1987, the Times had this to say: "Garret Fitzgerald has been one of the strongest influences in the public life of Ireland for perhaps 2 decades. He spoke a new language, breaking away from the Civil War lexicon of many of his older political confreres. He spoke of economic growth, of the challenge of Europe, of peace and reconciliation in the north, of tolerance and pluralism in the south." Both of these political leaders, Lamass and Fitzgerald, had very clear and very coherent visions of how they felt the country should develop and prosper. These visions were largely driven and delivered upon by the strength of their leadership and were catalysed by some pivotal moments in Irish history. For Lamass, high unemployment, heavy emigration and slow growth in every aspect of the economy provided the background for him to drive through economic reforms that at the time were opposed by a multitude of vested interests. Where Fitzgerald may not have succeeded in economic reforms, he transformed the relationship between church and state for the first time in history. He permanently institutionalised Ireland's role as an equal partner alongside Britain in determining the future of Northern Ireland. And Garret was unquestionably the driving force behind these momentous reforms. These developments could not have been made possible but for his ability to persuade the Irish people, and equally the Irish people were susceptible to persuasion because of the rapidly changing social environment in Ireland at the time. Pivotal moments in our very short history created the environment for these two towering political figures to drive through some visionary change. Their leadership, which combined only lasted for 15 years, had a more enduring positive impact on this country than all previous and subsequent Taoiseach. It is not, however, just individual political leaders or figures who have the capacity to shake up the status quo. It's easy, for example, to dismiss the Green Party's contribution to Irish politics, particularly given their undoubted centrality in the decision-making which surrounded the economic and financial crisis which the state faced in 2008. However, it is only fair and right to recognise that the Green Party did bring the so-called Green Agenda into the mainstream long before any of the major political parties were concerned about reducing carbon emissions. The party tapped into a European and indeed a global movement that created awareness amongst the public and amongst policymakers alike, thus ensuring that its ideas were either adopted or modified or plainly plagiarised by the other, perhaps more established political parties. Similarly, the arrival of the Progressive Democrats in 1985 brought about an ideological attack on the state's defunct role in the economy and society that had never before been crystallised by either Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil. As Ireland's economy began to improve, the promotion of low taxation, low public spending and privatisation became a politically palatable offer for the three major parties. There's no question, though, that the very creation of the Progressive Democrats led to substantive changes in how all parties viewed tax and expenditure. The PDs were electorally successful because of the combination of visionary leadership and, of course, need we forget, an electorate which was disillusioned by Mr Haughey's autocracy at the time. The programme that the party which I know best, Fine Gael, ran on in the last election was the much derided and oft-repeated 5-point plan. And at the risk of giving any of the political correspondents here a severe headache, I think it is worth repeating what the 5-point plan was. Number one was to help to protect and create jobs, and I think on this metric it has to be said that they have been reasonably successful. The total number of full-time employed in Ireland has increased by 46,400 people. Number two was to keep taxes low while meeting deficit targets. This ambition has not quite been achieved. The headline rate of income tax has not increased, true, but income eligibility for paying the higher rate of tax has significantly reduced. Property tax, increased motor tax, soon to be introduced water charges and, of course, the slashing of tax relief for health insurance means that the proportion of income paid to government by the average worker has in fact increased substantially over the lifetime of this government. Number three of the 5-point plan was a promise to deliver smaller and better government. Both of these promises have been demonstrably unfulfilled. The abolition or merger of 100 state agencies was promised by the government, but instead only 45 have been abolished and 33 new bodies have been created, leaving a net reduction of just 12 out of 100 agencies that were promised for rationalisation. Better government also requires genuine public sector reform, and I know that you're hearing a lot about this over the course of this summer school. There has been no meaningful reform of the public sector, with the exception of some arbitrary savings in working hours and salaries. The most basic requirement to create better government is that there are consequences for senior management failure. These do not exist and are nowhere to be seen on the horizon. Number four was the pledge to create a completely new, fairer, more efficient health system. The major planks of Minister James Riley's health reforms relating to the provision of direct care have spectacularly failed. The HSE continues to run a budget deficit of hundreds of millions each year. Young doctors are leaving our shores because of third world working conditions, and the glut of administrators within the service remains completely untouched. Finally, number 5 promised an overhaul in the way our political system works to stamp out cronyism and low standards. And I think of all of the unfulfilled promises, this is probably the most galling, because it is, in fact, the easiest one to achieve. All that is required is political leadership. The cronyism that persisted in Fianna Fáil for over a decade, and which I spoke about in a previous speech which I delivered here at the MacGill Summer School, is as prevalent as ever in the current government. Sadly, there is no real commitment to drive it out of Irish public life, and we are all the poorer for this abject failing. It may justifiably be argued that on the number 1 priority, namely generating employment, this government has, to a large extent, delivered on its promise. But what next? What vision for the future of the country actually exists? Is the future of our country going to again be fashioned by a club of developers, of wealthy tax exiles, of domestic influential bankers? There's no evidence to suggest any dramatic shift in economic focus. There is no radical economic vision being offered. Where is the democratic revolution and its economic counterpart? Was it for this, more of the same, that people voted in record numbers 3 short years ago? I don't believe it is. Across Europe, by contrast, some new visionary political leaders are beginning to emerge. The far-right gains in France, Austria and Greece are not the vision that I am referring to. Of course, we have to be vigilant to these populist and often very racist movements. But there is a spark of something else emerging in countries that have experienced crisis, for example in Italy and in Slovenia. In Italy, the election of Matteo Renzi as Prime Minister has transformed the political dynamic. The effect of Renzi's election doesn't get a whole lot of coverage here in Ireland, but I think it's fair to say that the credibility that he exudes, both domestically and internationally, has been a monumental stabilising force for the Eurozone. In the European elections in May, Renzi's party, the Social Democrats, bucked the trend in Europe by taking a whopping 40% of the popular vote, fending off challenges from both the extreme left and the extreme right. Renzi, who is a 39-year-old ex-Boy Scout from Florence, take note, Mr Lacey, I know Councillor Lacey, former ex-Boy Scout as well. He won the allegiance of the Italian electorate by promising to reform Italy's political and economic systems. He pledged to modernise Italy's labour market by allowing companies to hire people on 3-year temporary contracts. He vowed to balance the budget by drastically cutting public spending and by prosecuting tax dodgers who are valued at an estimated €100 million annually, which is a pretty extraordinary figure. He also wants to simplify the country's notoriously complex political system by reforming the Parliament and passing a new electoral law. Critically, he has not pandered to the populist Eurosceptic rhetoric in Italy, but rather has outlined a vision for cooperation, for reform and for persuasion at EU level. Take note, Mr Cameron, the Italian people have in fact responded in their millions. In Slovenia, a country with an economic profile not too dissimilar to our own, a party that was created 6 weeks before the recent general election won 36.8% of the vote. The election came about amidst a background of a banking crisis and political corruption. Sounds somewhat familiar. The leader of the new party did not offer populist solutions, but again offered to reduce the budget deficit and, crucially, to restore trust and pride in public institutions. And he himself, I think, has quite a degree of public support and credibility, and that has translated. The crisis has finally generated in some parts of Europe, arguably the Netherlands is another example, albeit in small degrees, some visionary political leadership. Such leadership is the only possible catalyst for meaningful and enduring reform. It is extraordinary that in the aftermath of the economic catastrophe that we have experienced in this country, that no really radical and inspiring vision and leadership has emerged, at least not yet. It is clear that the conditions for fundamental change do exist. The questions are simply who, when and what. There are many people both within and, I think importantly, outside of the current political system who believe in a better Ireland, who believe that politics can be less cynical, more honest, more transparent, and who genuinely believe in an economic vision which empowers Irish people, making them masters of their own destiny rather than slaves to either the market or the state. These people must soon stand up and be counted. Ireland deserves better, and the window of opportunity will not be there forever. Thank you.